Good morning and welcome. My name is Alex Bayen. I'm a professor of electrical engineering and computer science and also the director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Berkeley. And it's my real pleasure to launch this event today. We're honored at the Institute of Transportation Studies to have been chosen to host this event at Berkeley. I want to take this opportunity to thank a lot of people in the audience who have participated to the organization of this visit today, in particular the team of Emmanuel Lebrun-Damias, the General Counsel of San Francisco, Jean-Baptiste Bordes and Juliette Donadieu, and many other other teams. I want to thank the CNRS delegation as well as all the people both in Washington and Paris. We even have people who flew from Paris for this event today. So I want to thank all of them for this organization, in particular Radek Stompor, Sylvette Tourmente, and locally Professor Saul Perlmutter and Nicole Pagano. Now, in the US landscape, I think UC Berkeley has a very special place as kind of a flagship signature public university. And in that sense, it is probably one of the institutions which has the most similarities with the institutions we have in France. And so it's no wonder that many of the elected officials, congressmen, senators, ambassadors have come to Berkeley or have been connected to Berkeley because they're intrigued about the way things happen on this campus. In fact, just in my lifetime, I have seen Jean-David Lévite, François Delattre, and Gérard Haraud, all in different capacities who came to Berkeley. And today we're particularly thrilled that on his first visit to our campus, the ambassador chose to give a lecture on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and that's the first time this happens. And you can tell, in fact, I think this is the only time I've seen more professors than students in the audience. And that's mostly because most of the students are still skiing or on the beach or having fun, but you can see this is a vacation day at UC Berkeley. And so because also there were a lot of requests on your time and we couldn't accommodate all of them, I really want to thank everybody for the flexibility you have shown. And I'm going to do something we never do, is that even before you're introduced, we're going to re-invite you to come to our campus again so you can spend more time with us. And with this, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dean Liu, who will moderate and introduce the ambassador.
Right. Thank you so much, Alex. Good morning, everyone. And an extra special welcome for those of you who traveled here from France. Can you raise your hand so we can recognize you? Well, it's fantastic. Thank you so much. So really is our honor and our pleasure to host His Excellency Philippe Étienne, Ambassador of France to the United States. As was mentioned by Alex, we have a large number of partnerships with collaborators, colleagues in France. And so this is really timely, this talk. Now, a large number of the partnerships that the UC Berkeley campus has with France actually reside in the College of Engineering, just leveraging the size and the excellence of our research programs. Then these partnerships also leverage the elite system of the Grande École in France, in particular the prestigious École Normale Supérieure and École Polytechnique. As a matter of fact, Ambassador Etienne is a graduate of the prestigious École Normale Supérieure in France. He majored in mathematics. And he also earned a master's degree in mathematics and a graduate degree in economics. It's quite distinguished. So Ambassador Etienne was trained at the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration, known as ENA. As many of you in the audience probably know, this is a French hybrid of the Kennedy School of Government and the Harvard Business School here in the United States. And these schools have graduated the many recent presidents of France. ENA has graduated recent presidents of France, secretaries, and members of the cabinet of diplomats of France. Now, Ambassador Etienne is a graduate of the Voltaire class. Many of you might know that ENA names their classes not after the years, but after significant historical figures representative of the class. And this was selected by the class. Now, Voltaire is particularly relevant today, more than ever, because it refers to an age of enlightenment and the notion of tech for good, as we will hear today, reflected in the ambassador's remarks. Ambassador Etienne has been the diplomatic advisor of France's President Emmanuel Macron for the last 2 years. In his very long and distinguished career as a diplomat, the ambassador has held a variety of high-level positions. And in particular, he was ambassador of France to Romania from 2002 to 2005, and ambassador of France to Germany from 2014 to 2017. And he also is a permanent representative of France to the European Union from the years 2009 to 2014. Now, in addition to this wonderful experience in embassy positions, the ambassador also has had global experience, and in particular, he was Director General of International Cooperation and Development from 2005 to 2007, and he was the organizer of the 2019 G7 Summit in Biarritz, France, and Sherpa under President Emmanuel Macron. As a career diplomat, he's highly decorated civil servant of France, and in particular, he is the officer of the Legion of Honor. He is an officer of the Legion of Honor and commander of the National Order of Merit. So you can see why this is really a tremendous honor for us to host His Excellency here today. So it's my great pleasure to welcome him to the stage. And please join me in welcoming Ambassador Etienne for this talk to hear about tech for good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation, Madam Dean. I am, as I told you, very much impressed and still more impressed now, since I know that some of you, certains d'entre vous sont venus directement de Paris, j'espère que ce n'est pas pour m'écouter seulement. And since I know there are more teachers than students, and probably all of you or most of you knowing much better the topic than me, the topic I will now try to talk about. But first of all, and I would like to wish you all here a happy new year. We are in 2020. Round years have this strange virtue to invite us to take a step back and to consider the world from a larger perspective, with its deeper trends that are the hardest to perceive in the noise of everyday life, and yet they are the most relevant to our future. Of course, thinking of the last decade reminds us of many shocking images, wars, terrorism, pandemics, but it was also a decade that witnessed the first robot landing on a comet, the observation of the Higgs boson and gravitational waves, the opening of a new chapter in biology with the CRISPR tools, and UC Berkeley is no foreign to that. Among the technological changes since 2010, artificial intelligence has been at the forefront. AI has switched from fantasy to maturity. Deep learning is becoming a part of more and more companies. These are the engines of the fourth industrial revolution. France is actively participating in this revolution with our entrepreneurs, our scientists, our engineers. I was trained in mathematics, so I hope you will forgive me if I say that 13 French mathematicians have received the Fields Medal, ranking second to the US with 14 medals. And France is the fourth country in the world in terms of Nobel Prizes with 70 rewards. Our country remains highly specialized in mathematics. The proportion of mathematics as a share of its total publications is 70% higher than the world average. France is also specialized in physics, earth sciences, astronomy, astrophysics, and computer science. All this has now to be considered within what we call the European scientific space, where students and researchers move freely. I say this because, indeed, I was ambassador of France to the European Union, and I had the honor to negotiate a couple of framework research and development programs of the European Union. In 2018, scientists in the EU produced about 25% of the global share of peer-reviewed science and engineering papers, which is more than either China or the United States. The European Research Council granted a budget of 13 billion euros between 2014 and 2020, and one-fifth or nearly one-fifth of the projects it financed were considered fundamental breakthroughs. We take pride in our policy that offers researchers and students the time and security they need to explore, learn, and think. Nature has not found a better way to innovate than trials and mistakes. When in the 80s, Yann Lequin was doing his PhD at Université Pierre et Marie Curie, very few people would have bet that deep convolutional network would become the basis of modern widespread artificial intelligence for automatic image understanding. I could also mention Luc Julia for vocal recognition, Emmanuel Charpentier for CRISPR technology, and the numerous physicists that have participated in the observation of the Higgs boson. On the top of that, let me remind, I do it very often in the United States, that entrepreneur is a French word. And we see here, the effect is always very, very clear when I say that. And we see year after year a steep increase in the number of companies created in France. The French ecosystem is strong, nearly 10,000 startups. They raised $3.6 billion in 743 deals in VC in 2018. It is a 40% increase compared to 2017 in 1 year. The world's largest startup incubator is, as you may know, in Paris, Station F. This bubbling activity is also supported by foreign investment as a result of some very, very important reforms that have been undertaken in the recent years to increase the attractiveness of our economy. The United States contributes to this positive trend in France. In terms of scientific collaboration, the US remains France's first partner with an exponential increase in co-publications. Through the last decade, the number of papers published with an American and a French author went from 6,000 to 12,000 per year. We support this progress through the creation of bilateral funds to support research in all fields of science, the first one of which was founded here in Berkeley 25 years ago, with very concrete results. One of the projects financed by the France Berkeley Fund resulted in the opening of an international research center for cosmology here in UC Berkeley. This center is named in the memory of an extraordinary scientist, Pierre Binetruy, and I look forward to visiting this center later today. This collaboration between our two countries translates in the industry. The United States is a leading foreign investor in France. Reciprocally, French companies support 730,000 jobs, and in California, nearly 90,000. And in California, France is the number 3 foreign investor through these jobs created by its companies. These figures show that our country remains faithful to its adventurous spirit and to the advancement of industry, knowledge, and humanity. But we are careful in this effort because we know that, like any technological breakthrough, the fourth industrial revolution will generate many challenges. Automation is both a source of global wealth and a huge challenge for many workers. If the effects of this phenomenon on the labor market are not clear in the long run, it seems obvious that there will be a profound shift in the skill set of workers towards fields that are difficult to automate. Without proper preparation, the risk is to further widen the gaps between integrated and fringe populations in globalization and to weaken our social cohesion. New technologies require new regulations. The commercial deployment of autonomous vehicles, for example, cannot be imagined without thoroughly reviewing the concept of liability. This process must be led with the goal of producing frameworks that allow innovation without falling into anarchy. The same goes for facial recognition or drones. Another issue that should be at the center of our concern is the management of personal data. At a time when hundreds of thousands of consumers voluntarily offer their genetic information to private genealogy companies, when the data collected on social networks allow for the profiling and the influence of voters, we have to think of new ways to empower individuals in identifying and controlling their data, what they want to share, with whom and for what purpose. This requires a delicate chemistry that must not hinder more than necessary the development of medical, industrial, or urban planning tools made possible only by the abundance of data. Above all, we have to consider the impact of digital technologies on our democratic contract. These questions are complex and difficult. No easy solutions can be found, but we have to start by getting the diagnosis right. Many of the most innovative thinking on this question is coming from the United States, and especially from the leading universities and academic centers in the US, and in particular here in California. First of all, we have to recognize that digital technologies have an impact on human relationship. We know that social networks connect people in new and effective ways. But we have also experienced the fact that they can lead to new solitudes, to addictions, and to increased social fragmentation. In addition, our democracies in the US and in Europe alike have always tried historically to address excessive concentration of power and wealth. The theory of deconcentration and balance of power, whether economic or political, is an important part of the tradition in our democracies. However, the trends coming from the digital revolution have led to a moment which was not expected. The dreams of the founding fathers, who imagined a decentralized internet, was replaced by a strong concentration of the digital economy with a few very big companies. Moreover, a vibrant debate exists in our countries about the way algorithms function and can induce biases against the fair functioning of the market, against people in the hiring or on the marketplace, bias and possible manipulation also in the access to information. On all these questions, we have been there before. This is not the first time that technology developed in a way that rules governing and protecting the democratic contract are somewhat lagging behind. But this is the first time that this process is going so fast, and in a moment when democracies have been already affected and shaken by shocks and tensions, whether financial or social. I'm convinced that the solutions will not come from one country. First, I'm convinced that they will come. They will not come from one country, but rather from a cooperation and a dialogue among our democracies. But this should also and will also come from a dialogue between our civil societies, our tech entrepreneurs, our universities. Our international order was built after World War II here in San Francisco and in Bretton Woods on a common approach of common challenges. This is where we have to start now to build a shared governance. History teaches us that there is no reason why humanity would not be able to organize itself the way it did with the previous revolutions in order to maximize its benefits and mitigate its risks. The shorter this phase, the better. This raises the question of our ability to craft the right rules to prevent a fragmentation of regulation, which would jeopardize its effectiveness and acceptability. And this raises, for me as a diplomat, but also as a citizen, the question of the future of multilateralism. Multilateral political action appears all the more urgent since the movements at stake, globalization, climate change, digital revolution, but also increase of inequalities, are gradually eroding the capacity for action of our national governments. In particular, digital services bring a gap between economic activity and territory. They require us to think of the fiscal sovereignty of states differently, of defining it in the cyberspace, Otherwise, the tax competition allowed by services that exist everywhere and nowhere will inevitably reduce the power of action of states and thereby the power of collective and democratic decision. The task at hand is only made harder by the fact that multilateralism is criticized, is in a crisis. And indeed, the multilateral framework, which we have been having since World War II, must be anyway adapted, must be transformed to take into account our global challenges, the new global challenges, and the new role of new actors. We need, but even if we have to reform our international order, we need more than ever a collective and serene conversation, sincere listening, and the search for fair compromises to solve these common problems. Let me quote my distant predecessor, not the ones you have quoted, who came to Berkeley before me. No, he's Jean-Jules Jusserand. He was ambassador from 1903 to 1924, quite a long term, exactly a century ago, at a time when the world saw the breakthrough towards multilateralism after the first Hague Conference in 1899. He said, I quote, it's a long quotation, excuse me. I start. When one man, then another, had come and said, I can draw the lightning from the clouds. I can rise in the air. I can flash your words and thoughts to any distance you please. I can cure rabies by inoculating rabies. I can make you talk with your friend miles away. I can navigate a boat under the sea. Skepticism had scarcely been greater than when this conference took the world by surprise. In spite of skepticism, that first conference reached an unexpected measure of success. 8 years later, a second one was convened on the felicitous suggestion of President Roosevelt. And now, the supposedly useless mechanism from dreamland has been so heartily accepted by mankind at large, all over the globe, that the approximate date for a third one has already been selected. Governments at first doubted that one would be of any use. Now they want more. End of quotation. 100 years later, France still believes in the potential of international cooperation. And France wants to work with many others to build new multilateral platforms in order to be able to solve the crisis of our time. This is why our President, Emmanuel Macron, organized the 2 Paris Peace Forums that drew together heads of state and governments, but also representatives of international organizations, non-governmental organizations, local authorities, businesses, foundations, intellectuals, journalists, activists. One of the topics discussed at the second Paris Peace Forum last November was artificial intelligence and the ethical questions it raises. France is once again betting on cooperation between states and all stakeholders and calls with Canada for the establishment of a structure similar to the IPCC for climate change that would deal with AI issues. The first AI for Humanity Forum was held in Paris in 2019. We can only hope that this initiative will grow and will find resonance among governments, companies, experts, scientists, particularly here in the Bay. President Macron also decided to include the digital economy and its challenges in the agenda of the 2019 French presidency of the G7. As you mentioned, I was his G7 Sherpa. Among the problems that require coordinated and vigorous action on our part, one good example is the spread of hate and terrorist content on the internet. It is not only a good example, it is a high priority. On March 15, 2019, internet users witnessed witnessed on social media the terrorist attack in Christchurch. France understood only too well the grief and pain of New Zealand. We needed to act together with Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, with the G7 members, with the tech industry, and with civil society. We launched the Christchurch Call. This call invites governments and digital companies to more transparency, more collaboration, and the implementation of tools preventing the repetition of this atrocity. We are glad that a number of internet platforms and tech companies have chosen to support it and have concretely acted, an example being the development of the new Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. With regard to the protection of personal data, we have already come a long way with the adoption of the European Union General Data Protection Regulation and the California Consumer Privacy Act. The implementation of the latter allows us to work together on a review of these first tools, to learn from them, improve them, and hope that others choose to join us in building the global standards for this industry in our democracies. Exchanging on experiences, learning from each other, and finding solutions together. On data privacy, the EU was maybe a source of inspiration for California. When it comes to the regulation of the gig economy, California is thinking ahead with the adoption of AB 5 by the Sacramento legislature. We are eager to see how this experiment unfolds and learn from it on how we can offer the adapted protection for this new form of work in our own country. To learn from each other, to discuss, to exchange, to cooperate, such should be the way of the world faced with the question of our common future. Such should be the face of the new multilateralism we need. This is how France opens the question of fiscal sovereignty of states in the digital world, doing so within international bodies as the European Union and the OECD. We also talk extensively with the industry. President Macron hosted the leaders of the most important tech companies for 2 Tech for Good summits. New commitments were made on these occasions, such as placing at least 30% of women in management and leadership positions by 2022. These efforts cannot be the sole fact of governments indeed. The questions raised by this subject involve us all, and in particular you, the scientists, engineers, students who live at the heart of the machine. I know that you have realized this, and to make the world a better place means also conscious employees calling out their companies in the US, like in Europe, on issues on inclusion, gender equality, climate, or artificial intelligence, and forcing them to remain faithful to the values they display. We need this kind of new citizen commitment, new citizenship in our societies, to build a world where the next generation will find indeed a better life, seizing all opportunities from the amazing technological revolution we are going through, while understanding all their implications for our common and global goods. This was my conclusion. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to having an exchange with you. I ask for your indulgence, and I hope I will be able at least to answer some of your remarks. Thank you very much.
All right, so the ambassador is gracious enough to take some questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question that you would like to ask. Really? Oh, it's right here. All right.
Yes, United Nations. Russia has proposed norms for cybersecurity or digitalization, and it appears that the European Union and the United States are opposed. Would you care to comment, especially as it regards to peace and national security?
Well, we consider that the United Nations Charter applies to the cyberspace. And we also consider that the international fora where you want to elaborate new norms must be chosen carefully. It is not a coincidence that we preferred to discuss at the level of the G7, for instance, those issues. And it is also true that we need more than states, as I said in my introduction, to discuss these issues. I was myself involved as a national security advisor in the run-up to the first Paris Peace Forum with big technological companies from the United States, including in preparing what we called, I didn't mention this one, but the call for a safe and open internet, which was adopted then and issue, which is now supported by many countries in the world, but also many companies and many NGOs. So again, we are not, on the contrary, against rules, hard law in this international life. We have this on the top of the UN Charter. We have some conventions which exist on the cybersecurity, which do exist. We have to implement. But then we need this conversation, and of course we have to strike a balance. And it's a very delicate balance between security, between the right to speech, our freedoms, our democracies, and between the necessity to fight against abuses of internet, or such as the ones I mentioned when I mentioned Christchurch and the Christchurch call.
China is using AI surveillance to control its citizens and population. In certain parts of the country has become police state. So I understand France and Europe has strong regulations on this, but what is France and Europe's position, not only to make France and Europe a better place, but the world a better place?
Well, this is more or less one of the important reasons which led France and Canada to take the initiative I mentioned, and to take it as a discussion here again in the G7, and based on the OECD, which has developed its own set of principles quite recently on artificial intelligence. I think that it's in the interest, and we hope the US will be part of this, of course, of our democracies to build common standards. And again, to build them thinking of all implications, including the ones you mentioned. Again, it's about freedom, it's about democracy. And again, in a conversation which is not only among states, but also with other people, with the civil societies and with science and with business. It's the model I used, I mentioned of the IPCC on climate change, or IPBES, maybe you know, on biodiversity. We think it's a new way of doing diplomacy, and when I mentioned we must adapt and reform our multilateral order. Another example was the Paris Climate Conference at the end of 2015, COP21, you know, the one which led to the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement. This convention, it was both a United Nations, a classical United Nations negotiation in the framework of the UN convention, the UN convention, which did exist already has been existing for some time. But this agreement between countries would not have been possible without a mobilization, which also took place in Paris in December 2015. We had a lot of fora. We had local governments, for instance, coming together, big cities. We had business initiatives. We had NGOs, we had science, and the base, actually, of the climate negotiation is science through the IPCC. So we need both to engage with the societies and to care for the values we will continue to want to have in the future, like we did in the past.
Building off of that, you mentioned that the answers won't come from any one country, rather from global cooperativism. I'm wondering what challenges currently impede that, and what you anticipate in the future would prevent that cooperativism.
What could prevent this collaboration? Yeah. Well, unfortunately, more than one element. It's difficult. The problems are difficult. The problems are complex, and the interests of people are very, very different, both amongst or between states, different categories of states, developing, emerging countries. Countries laying more or less focus on certain freedoms or certain values, but also among between states and other stakeholders. Well, as I mentioned, we see this today. There is the danger that states lose. Well, maybe it is not a danger for some people after all, but the margin of maneuver of our parliaments, of our governments may be reduced by all the events. So, and the third element is of course the fact that to adopt solutions through cooperations, through collective negotiations, we must all agree to have this form of organization in the world, and it is not absolutely the case today. There are other patterns, more bilateral. So we must resolve all those issues, or not resolve the issues, but we must agree on all of this. Even when we at the beginning very much, if not disagree, but are very much far away one from the other. But I think I am optimistic by nature, and I think that the challenges are such that the pattern of an international cooperation will be stronger, will be the only possible way to solve the issues. But we see that now we are in I see myself, maybe I'm wrong, I see the state of our world now in a sort of a transition where it is not enough to defend. I try to do that in my introduction. It is not enough to say we must keep this multilateral order. We must keep the multilateralism. It is not enough. We must recognize, and it is normal, the world has changed a lot, that what we have built, what our fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers have built after the Second World War is not anymore adapted. We must reform the WTO, even some organizations such as the WTO, which have been created in the 1990s. We must advance. But I repeat, I cannot believe we will be able to go forward without a new form of international cooperation and multilateralism.
Hello. Do you think, so from a French perspective or an European perspective, we should build a framework to protect our startups, our ideas from Google, from Amazon, from Facebook? Because let's say you have an idea in France, and the big question you have is, what if Google does it? So how can you do to protect our investments and our ideas as a French? Do you think we should protect them?
Well, thank you. I don't see it necessarily from a perspective of protection, because in a market economy, on a marketplace, it's we have mergers, and we have companies buying some companies buying other companies. But we have to be careful about our the way we conduct our public policies, considering such effects. And there is, as you know, something which is called the competition policy. It is one of the basic, on a market economy, on a market, for a market economy, one of the basic features which Europe has very much learned from the United States, by the way, is the competition policy, which is both in the European Union, which is the example I know because I've worked in this framework. There are three branches of the competition policy. One is the antitrust policy. One is mergers control. We have a regulation to control mergers. And one is the control of state subsidies, which would more apply to other countries, of course. So we have to use these instruments, and the European Union has made use of this, especially with the companies you mentioned. Now, another answer, which we try to develop in France, which is how we can help our own entrepreneurs to develop their own business. And here, I must say, we look very much at you, at the Silicon Valley, of course, at how such an ecosystem could develop and thrive. And so we have very much developed our policy for French startups. As I said, there is a lot of big successes, and to give them the dimension which will allow them to compete on the market and not to be bought at very early stages. We try to solve the issues they have to achieve this result. One of the issues which we in Europe didn't know to handle as efficiently as in the US is the financing. We must develop, and we have been developing, I mentioned a figure, through venture capital, in particular through equity financing. We have been developing new instruments in Europe, which we had not. But one other way of doing things to help our companies to grow bigger and is to help them to go to the United States, actually. Because the US market is I think the best way, the best test also to grow. And once you have established your presence on the French and the European markets, it makes quite sense to go, not for everybody, of course, but for many of those new companies to come to the American market and to learn from it, not only to use the size of a market and the vibrant technological environment, but also to have a big market to develop. So things go in both directions. You're right to mention this risk, and so I try to answer on what it's only a part of the answer, of course. I don't want to be too long, but we have tools to answer this challenge you mentioned. And for the time being, I don't want to be over-optimistic, but we see in the 2 last years, through financing, through the growth of financing for startups in France, and also through the consequential growing of the companies themselves, we see positive signals. And if things then go in the direction you mentioned, again, we have public policy tools to be used.
There's one question here, and then we'll go in the Spanish next.
Yeah, I wonder what your thoughts and perspectives are about the forces which are, as I see, combating everything you and other people like you want to do. The anti-science, the reality-denying forces which in some countries, including this country, have had a very strong political expression sometimes, which would seem to block trying to do the important things you're talking about.
I'm not sure I understood well. It was about freedom of speech?
No, the people who deny science.
Okay, oh yeah, yes, okay. No, of course. No, of course. No, it's really a big issue. We have launched a couple of years ago, I think it was 3 years ago, a day of science. We have to defend science. It's quite new, and of course, one of I think the origin of this was the discussion, the debate on climate change, of course. But you find this, what you describe in other fields as well. So I think that one thing which is absolutely essential is education, for me, to address this challenge. Education and also access to education in science and technologies, what we call STEM, especially for all, with the issue of gender equality, by the way, but this is maybe another issue, but still very important. And the first answer to this for me is education. But then it's also the public debate. We must really, of course, encourage also the scientific communities to participate in the debates. And I will quote again the sort of international organizations which we have for climate or biodiversity. And we must give a large echo to what those bodies, which are mostly based on science and which are international, publish. We had, for instance, the first very comprehensive report by the International Panel on Biodiversity, the IPBS, which was presented to in France because we had the G7 presidency. We tried to give as much echo as possible to these terrible findings about the loss of biodiversity, and stress the fact that it is based on science and it's a consensus of the scientific community. So education and debates would be my answer, but also a strong political action as we do on some of these negotiations, of course.
Maybe the last question. There's one here. Thank you.
Thank you. So today we discussed the technological development in two developed countries. What do we do simultaneously to include the developing countries in this development, not to leave them behind? Thank you.
Yes, this is a huge challenge, of course, because these developing countries are very often among the first who suffer from the global challenges we have to solve through scientific, through science and development. So one of the big issues in our international negotiations is these countries saying, look, we want the access to knowledge, we want the access to science. This is a real issue. And I think that I will take only the example of Africa and climate change, of course. We can tell them you must build up your energy resources without developing coal or hydrocarbons. You must go directly to renewables and so on. But to do that, we need to help those countries also to develop their own technologies. And they have the capacity. They have the capacity. I myself, as I said, I was trained as a mathematician, and from my very, very distant scientific past, I've kept, in mathematics, for instance, some good friends in France who did incredible, who have built very, very amazing bridges with mathematicians in Africa. There is this capacity. So there is this capacity in those countries to go to develop artificial intelligence, to develop new clean technologies, but we really need to help them developing their own capacities. I don't think it is credible to say, okay, we will bring the technologies to you. The real issue, the only solution is to give them, to help them getting some tools to develop their own science, because they have this capacity, at least in some sciences. Well, it depends on how much they need to invest money, of course. There is a question of financing, but I'm sure there's a capacity. And one of the things we try to do with Africa is at the European level, but also at the level of France, is also to help those countries to build their own scientific capacities.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. I'd like to thank Ambassador Etienne one more time for sharing with us his perspective.
Okay.
And we would like to present you with a small gift as a token of our appreciation from the College of Engineering.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you.
So thank you once again for sharing with us how it's really urgent now for us to collaborate across international boundaries to ensure that technology will be used for good, for the benefit of all in our global societies. So thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.